Welcome to the Region Free Gamers podcast. Today, we're talking about the golden age of one of our favorite developers.
Welcome back to the Region Free Gamers podcast, the podcast that is fluent in gaming. We are available in every reputable podcasting service, so if you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe or leave us a review. With that out of the way, let us introduce the Region Free Gamers that are joining us today. My name is Ozzy, and I am currently in the cozy confines of New York. And to the north of me, in Canada, we have Grandmaster Moose, Paul.
Hello, my name's Paul. I like video games.
And to the south of me, in Washington, D.C., we have the Puerto Rican Puzzle Master, Arnaldo.
Hey guys, what's going on?
And we are talking today about one of the greatest time periods in gaming, and one that is very near and dear to the hearts of many gamers, and that is the 32-bit era. I think in particular, that's the era that I kind of grew up in. I think also the era that Arnie grew up in. So It's very close to my heart. In particular, we're going to be talking about Squaresoft, and they're the RPG giants that are best known for the Final Fantasy series. And Squaresoft was the company that was before they merged with fellow RPG giant Enix. So Squaresoft had a very prolific output in the 90s, and it probably was one of the most fruitful periods for any developer that went even beyond Final Fantasy. And we're going to be talking probably between 1995 to 2000. So it's going to be really exciting because there are a lot of titles, a lot of quirky titles that you may not have heard of that go even beyond Final Fantasy. But as we usually do, we would like to talk a little bit about some of the games that we have been playing lately. And since Paul didn't join us for the last episode, and we feared that he might have been kidnapped by a moose, maybe we can start with you.
It was only temporary. It was a benevolent moose that let me go back to my family. Basically, it was a catch and release, is what it was.
Was there a ransom?
Yeah, it was something like hay or whatever moose eat.
I was gonna ask, what do moose eat?
Yeah, I don't really know, to be honest with you. I don't think moose are dangerous in the they want to eat people sense. I think I would imagine they're herbivores, but I mean, holy crap, man, they're gigantic. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen one up close, but they are huge, and they must just eat all day long in order to maintain that.
See, in my personal kind of lore, I think there's a moose mafia up there in Whitehorse where you're at, Paul, and they don't get along with the Ontario mooses.
No, they almost certainly do not. They're a hardier moose up here, and the Ontario moose are kind of like the 1% moose, okay. And we don't like them. No,
so they're the Harlan mooses. Okay, got
Truth
it.
be told, the more reasonable kidnapping would be from bears. We actually have had bears in our neighborhood.
Oh wow!
And there's like a Facebook group everybody follows, which is sort of like, kind of like a bear alert. So there's a grocery store like 2 blocks from my house, and there was a family of bears just kind of hanging out there, going through the garbage. And it's like, where the hell am I? So on that note, I've been playing Metal Gear Solid 2.
Metal Gear Solid 2. Think I've heard of that before.
Yeah, it's a little, a little indie developed title that came out a little while ago.
Probably never heard of it.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I started playing it last year. No, sorry, it was 2016. I was like, I have this weird history with MGS2 where I wanted to play it, back when it came out, right? But I was so hyped for it, and eventually I just kind of let it go because the expectation for it was just too high. Like, this game could never be as good as I hoped it would be. Yeah. And so it just kind of sat for years and years and years, and I never played it. And so in 2016, I was like, what's wrong with you, you idiot? Like, play Metal Gear Solid 2. You need to actually play this game. And so I started playing it. Final Fantasy 15 came out. I put it down, and then I didn't pick it up again. And recently I was like, again, this is stupid. You got to play this game. And when was the last time you guys? I'm assuming both of you have played it, yeah?
Yeah, I beat it. I think last time I beat it was in 2002. So it's been a long, long time. And I can still remember the crippling disappointment of the lolly lule lo. That was probably for me the jumping the shark moment for Metal Gear, unfortunately. And then they redeemed themselves with Metal Gear Solid 3. But I actually wanted to pick up the PS2 because of Metal Gear Solid 2, as I think 90% of people did. I actually had Son of the Enders, and I played through the demo, which Son of the Enders should be called the Metal Gear Solid 2 demo.
Yeah.
And I played through the ship level, and it was just amazing. I remember pouring through all the magazines and how they would tell you can shoot the magazines in the game and you can hold up soldiers and everything. There's destructible glass and the like. That initial level was such a masterpiece that I don't think anything that followed it could have really lived up to it, particularly when it came off the heels of the first Metal Gear Solid, which was such a tour de force. But even with that, I didn't mind Raiden. It was just such a boring game to me. The tanker levels, the fact that it was all in the tankers and the story was so nutty and bizarre, I just couldn't get into it, honestly. And I beat it and I went through it, but it felt like such a radical departure from the first Metal Gear Solid that it felt like I was almost playing an entirely different franchise. So
it really kind of does. Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with that. I've been enjoying it, I think, more than you. Raiden, I could take him or leave him, but and I think if it was a little bit more engaging, I probably would have just plowed through it the first time I tried to, a couple of years ago, instead of having to revisit it. But with that said, I mean, I don't know, man. It's still really good. Like, I've really been enjoying it. The boss fights are a little bit frustrating, maybe because I'm old now, I don't know. But it's been really good. Like, there's that set piece right in the middle with the helicopter and the Harrier and Raiden on the bridge, and you get the missiles. And, like, oh my god, that set piece is just awesome. Like, I was just smiling the whole time. I absolutely loved it. But strangely enough, after that set piece, you've got this, and I don't know if you guys remember, obviously it's been a long time, for you, Ozzy, Arnie, I'm not sure, but, after that set piece, you've got this thing where you have to kind of hop onto a pipe and then shimmy along the pipe, and, like, I mean, obviously it's a stealth game, right? But this whole jumping on a pipe, almost platforming thing, which, by the way, was very difficult, really, like, after that awesome set piece really kind of took me out of it. It was a bizarre choice. And I mean, obviously the game's not as good as the first one, but you're right, Ozzy. When it first came out, not that the PS2 needed a system seller, the fact that it was called PS2 was the system seller. But man, I remember seeing that preview video from the Tokyo Game Show, the one where Snake sneezes at the end. And like all the soldiers look at him. I don't know if you guys remember this preview video.
I remember it.
But what's that?
I remember it. Yeah, it was a big thing, and people, broke the replay button just watching it over and over and over again.
It was incredible.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And let it not be confused. Hideo Kojima is a master of hype, and we're seeing it right now with Death Stranding. He is able to pump up a game with an awesome trailer, or at least a trailer that leaves you talking. And with Metal Gear Solid 2, that was in full effect. And it was a game that he controlled the information that came through so well, to the point that no one knew that Raiden was the main character until they actually played the game. And little by little, people started figuring it out and saying, oh my god, he really is the main character. There is no Snake. And that was brilliant on his part, even though he probably pissed off maybe like 70% of his fan base.
Yeah, that was pretty risky. I don't know if it necessarily... I mean, look, it's a great game, so I can't really say that it hurt it too much, and obviously it sold really well. But that's a huge decision at the time, because I know even so many years later, after not knowing anything about the game, because I purposely avoided as much as I possibly could, the fact that I'm controlling Raiden for most of it was a bit of a shock. because you start off as Snake and everybody's happy, and then suddenly, I'm controlling this kid with kind of a whiny voice.
Yeah.
So
see, I disagree on the idea that it's a great game, and we could argue about that to infinity. But the reason why I disagree is because the game is very repetitive. The environment is very samey, and it's a constant back and forth backtracking through this tanker. And I don't think that the characters are as engaging. I think there are a few that could have been better developed, like Fortune and Vamp. And later on, we found out more about Vamp. But for example, for me, I think the moment where I sort of just threw my arms up in the air with the game was when I was playing the Fat Man levels, where he's on roller skates and he's just laying bombs and the like. And you also have to defuse bombs within a limited time period. And I don't know, to me, it felt so rote and so unengaging that I almost gave up right then and there. And honestly, I beat the game almost out of obligation. Paul, I imagine you haven't beaten it yet?
No, not yet. I think I'm about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through.
But let me tell you, I mean, if you haven't had any spoilers, that's a good thing, because the end is just bonkers. I would say the end almost redeems the whole game itself, because it just really goes bonkers. And it does what I love games doing. It plays with the player's expectations, and it kind of breaks the fourth wall in the very best way, which is something that Metal Gear Solid 1 also did with Psycho Mantis and the like. And this game also does that. So I do think that the end kind of redeems it. And I don't think it's a great game. I think it's a good game, but I don't want to take up the conversation. Arnie, have you played Metal Gear Solid 2?
So this is one of the reasons I don't like doing a podcast about this stuff, because now I have to admit that I've not played a single Metal Gear Solid game.
Get out of here.
Dude, I just got punched in the stomach.
And it's funny because I own all the main series games. I've just never beaten any of them. I even own the Metal Gear Solid collection on PS3 that has every single game on it. And it's one that I've always meant to go to and play. I played a little bit of 2 years ago with a friend, but we didn't get very far. And then I remember when I was young, I had a friend who played through 1, and it was one of those where I sort of watched him play through it. And everything I've heard about the series makes me want to play it, but I hate stealth games. I'm not good at them. I don't enjoy them, but I really want to give this series a try, because a lot of the stuff that I've seen from it looks so interesting and looks sort of much more engaging than other like stealth games that I've seen.
The storyline I haven't played through the later ones, obviously, but at least in Metal Gear Solid 1, and I've played other kind of stealth games. Like in the PS1 era, I played, I think, Siphon Filter, and I gave Splinter Cell a shot. And the fact is, the storylines in those games, like Metal Gear as a game, I don't know, Ozzy, would you say it's average?
No. I would say it's better than average. At least the original one. I think the original one was really trailblazing.
But I mean, like, just as gameplay itself. Forget about the story.
Gameplay. In terms of gameplay, I really think that it was. And honestly, for me, particularly being in Cuba when I first played the first Metal Gear Solid, I didn't know anything about story. So for me, it was all gameplay. I mean, the idea, all the conceits and themes of stealth games, most of it was laid down in the original Metal Gear Solid, with the field of vision, the cone of vision, something as subtle as leaving footprints in the snow, laying down an EMP grenade in order to disable the cameras and the like. All of that to me was just mind-blowing. So I would say, no, not average. I thought it was excellent. I think by the time Metal Gear Solid 2 came around, yes, I think the gameplay was average because it just didn't keep up with the times. But for the first Metal Gear Solid, I think even to this day, it's greater than average. It's just great fun, dude. Just playing around, it's really... Arnie, let me put it in this terms. It's like a puzzle. So you have to figure out how to get from point A to point B without triggering these alerts. And I find that to be great thrilling. And since you like puzzles, I think that's something that you would like, but I could see why it could be tense and something that you would not necessarily enjoy.
Yeah, I think one of my issues was I started, like, one of the first stealth games I played was Splinter Cell, and I did not care for it. It sort of soured me on the concept of it.
But you see, I like Splinter Cell, but the problem with Splinter Cell is that the story is so generic that it's very difficult to become invested. Splinter Cell for me is one of those gameplay first games. I really love the gameplay, at least in the first three. And also the most recent one that came out, Blacklist, which was an excellent underrated game that almost no one played. But it just lacks in character because it's such a generic kind of espionage, political, Tom Clancy intrigue, right-wing thriller. And I don't really care for that. But Metal Gear Solid, man, I mean, it's just, if only for the insane, nutso characters, you just have to play it. And particularly the first one. The first one is probably the tightest in terms of narrative. Yeah. It's not as crazy as Metal Gear Solid 2. It's not as politically involved as Metal Gear Solid 3. It's just the perfect tight thriller. And I think if you have, 15 hours to spare, play through the original. Not the Twin Snakes. Play through the original, the one on PS1.
Okay.
Yeah, I won't disagree with that. And one more thing to add to it. Every once in a while, sometimes the dialogue between Jack and Rose I could do without. But especially, like, what great timing. Every once in a while, my wife will come downstairs and she'll sit down and she'll see what I'm playing, particularly if there's a lot of voice dialogue, because watching me play a shoot 'em up is not terribly exciting. But, something where she's listening and there's a story, every once in a while she'll come down and kind of watch. She did that a lot with Persona 4, actually. Persona 4 is like her favorite game, even though she never played it. And so she comes downstairs and I'm playing MGS2, and Jack and Rose are having one of their conversations, and Rose says, "Jack, are you with me because I'm beautiful?" And my wife literally snorted like a pig. She's like, "Come on, really?"
I mean, Paul, there's a scene where they discuss King Kong. Really, in the middle of a very, I don't know if you got in there yet, but in the middle of
yeah.
And I was just thinking, what the hell? It's very corny. It's very, very corny. But in any case, Arnie, what have you been playing?
I've essentially been playing the same stuff. A lot of Parasite Eve in preparation for this episode. And, I haven't put a ton of time into it. I think I'm about 4 hours into it. But I think I'm about halfway done, because I think they set it up as a 6-day thing, and I'm already on day 3. So
it's not a very long game.
Point.
Yeah, I think we can do the math on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I've been playing. I've been really enjoying it. The combat system is equal parts intriguing and terrifying, because I'm afraid that it's one of these things where if I don't set up my weapons just right, it's going to screw me over in the future.
Well, I mean, it's the perfect blend of survival horror and an RPG. And in survival horror, at least you know that your inventory is really king, and whatever you have in your inventory is what's going to decide whether you live or die. Whereas with Parasite Eve, you also have to take into account positioning, you have to take into account action points and the like. It can be a very stress-inducing battle system. And Arnie, maybe you have more experience since you have been playing it recently.
I really like it. At first, I was a little confused because they do give you a lot of freedom in terms of how you want to approach combat, like which weapons you want to use, what effects you want to have on your weapons, even down to the amount of shots that you want to dedicate to each enemy, which I thought was really cool. One of the things that I still haven't quite figured out how to get more effective shots on certain enemies, and I do think it has to do with positioning, but I'm not entirely sure how it works. But I'm sort of figuring it out now. It sort of opens up very, very gradually. They start giving you more tools to customize your weapons. And I like the idea of being able to take certain aspects of one weapon and put it on another weapon at the expense of the first weapon, just disappearing. It's a nice like risk reward, because unlike other RPGs, it's not a system where, so first you get this sword, and then, 30 minutes from now, you'll find another sword, and it'll be the same sword plus one. They don't scale sort of upwards. All weapons have 3 traits. I think it's ammo capacity, range, and attack power. And so you might find a rifle that has really long range and holds a lot of bullets, but maybe is not as strong as, a machine gun that has much shorter range, but is a lot more powerful. And so then you have to balance the risk reward of how close do I want to be to certain enemies based on what attacks they use on me. Because you're always able to move. It's not a static, so you're always able to move around enemies and actively dodge their attacks. So I really like figuring out what the best weapon combinations are for certain enemies.
Well, I don't know how in-depth we should get, but we might as well just talk about it. Parasite Eve is going to be one of the games that will be discussed in the later segment about Squaresoft. But I guess we might as well just talk a little bit about it. I love this game in the way that it presents a modern setting with an RPG gameplay. Just a little bit of context. This was released around the same time that Resident Evil was a great hit. I think it was released contemporaneously with Resident Evil 2. And survival horror was kind of the genre du jour at the time. Everyone wanted to do it. And Squaresoft did it with Parasite Eve, but they put their own spin on it, considering that they were RPG giants. And it was directed by the same director of Chrono Trigger, which was also another game where positioning played a huge role in your attacks, and you had kind of free movement within the battle scenario. And the battle scenario is limited to this playing field where you can move around through that playing field and dodge attacks and the like. And for me, when I first played Parasite Eve, it was kind of a refreshing change of pace, because I don't think I quite understood RPGs well enough. I think because I didn't have the language capabilities to be able to tell the systems apart and be able to really master them.
Yeah.
But for me, I love the fact that I was able to move around freely, which was not something that you could do in RPGs. You just had a static turn-based mechanic. And you don't have a party in Parasite Eve. You're just playing as Aya Brea, who is an NYPD detective. And I love the fact that, as you said, Arnie, it's a tight game in that it takes place within 6 days. And it's about this parasite, basically, this mitochondrial mutation that starts affecting all of New York City. So it takes place in New York City over Christmas. And it has a very Christmassy feel. There's snow everywhere. And I mean, the intro to that game, when I first saw it, just blew me away, because it's literally this opera singer, Eve, and Eve basically is the host for this mitochondrial mutation that basically kind of combusts everyone in this opera. She's an opera singer, and everyone in this opera starts burning to death. And the only one that's unaffected is your player character, Aya Brea, which, for reasons that will be explained later, she's not affected by the infection. So I thought it was such an innovative setting to place an RPG in, and one that you didn't see in the typical tropes of fantasy and the like that was prevalent in the RPGs of the time. And that mixture of inventory management and RPG, and also an element of also magic, which they don't call it magic here. I forgot what they call it. But
yeah, I forgot what they...
I think it's like mitochondrial something. I mean, it has to do with the mitochondria, which it's kind of like an insane kind of story. The idea that the mitochondria, which is one of the functions of cells, basically takes over your body and starts mutating. But whatever, it's sci-fi. Just take it as at face value. So I thought it was a really innovative game. And let me tell you, the score by... God, I forgot her name now, which is terrible.
It's not Street Fighter 2 chick, is it?
Yes, it is. So
Yuko
the score...
Shimomura?
Yeah, so the score was done by Yoko Shimomura, and I think to me, it's my favorite score from her. It's kind of this mixture of electronica with just kind of operatic elements, and I think that at this point she was really kind of coming into her own as a game composer, and it was some years before she did Kingdom Hearts, and to me it was one of the greatest elements of this game. I still listen to the score even when I'm at work. I just play it in the background. So, Paul, do you play Parasite Eve?
I did play Parasite Eve way back when it was released. It was, it was very unique looking, like you said, and also kind of, it's weird, man, because I've come around full circle on it. Back then, it was kind of short and kind of shallow. And so for me, as a 19-year-old with infinite time, that actually kind of was a strike against it. I liked RPGs with complex party systems, right? And so here you have an RPG that has a single character and she fires guns. And while the atmosphere was unique and really fantastic, by the time I finished it, I was like, okay, that was a nice little meal. But for me, it's not necessarily a classic. The context from which I was approaching the game was much different from yours.
Yeah, I mean, and it was one of the big criticisms of the game back when it came out, the fact that it was not that long, and people cited lack of replay value and the like, which, again, to me at this point, I played it at the time and I never beat it, and then I came back to it many, many years later, and at the point that I played it, I was actually going through law school, and it was kind of the perfect game to play through that time period because I got to experience the whole storyline and the whole system and the like within maybe 10 to 15 hours. And so it was the perfect size for me. So I think that's something that nowadays you could actually justify a lot more, and it's not quite the strike that it was at the time, because if it was an RPG, it had to be 50, 60, 70 hours in order to justify the purchase. So,
yes, exactly.
So I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore. And to me, Parasite Eve, out of all the Squaresoft games, it's one of the more cinematic ones. It's very much about the narrative. And that's something that I really enjoyed about it. The idea that the dialogue was really fantastic. It was really, leaps beyond what you would see in other RPGs or even games of the time. I think, honestly, Metal Gear Solid was one of the only ones that had better dialogue. So I really think it's a game that holds up, particularly because it has pre-rendered backgrounds. So yes. I don't know. I mean, you could pick it up on the PlayStation Network on the PS3 for $9.99, I think. So it's a game that I would recommend if you have a few hours to kill. Just take it for a spin.
And my understanding is that there is depth if you want it. I think after you beat the main story, you have the option of doing the what's it called, the Chrysler Building. Is that what it is? Which is like 100-story dungeon that like is super insane, and at the end of it, you have to fight like the secret final boss or something.
Yeah.
Wait, I didn't know about this.
Oh, you didn't know about this?
No, I didn't know about this.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. And you also, Arnie, at the end of the game, you also get like a super weapon that kind of combines all the best characteristics of all the weapons into one. So it's basically just super long range, high powered. I remember getting it at the end of the game and thinking, oh man, I gotta play through New Game Plus or whatever it is, the Chrysler Building. Yeah. Because I got this kick-ass weapon. And then, you know how it is, right? New Game Plus shows up and then it's like, all right, time for a new game. Yeah. But I have to admit, it did look really interesting.
Well, and apparently it's hard as all hell, because I think you can only save every like 10 floors or something like that.
Oh yeah.
And there's like very limited healing in between. So basically each floor is just like a different set of battles that you have to go through to climb each floor. But apparently it's extremely hard, especially getting towards the upper floors of the building. You really have to know how to like modify weapons effectively, like have, good armor and item layouts, know how to use your whatever it's called, your Eve or your magic abilities and stuff like that. And then I think, and I'm not sure, but I think that the end of the Chrysler Building, that boss, it might be like the true ending of the game, or like the canon ending of the game or something.
Wow,
I didn't even know about this,
choice.
so I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, and I know this might sound like a very bold statement, it's my favorite Squaresoft game, actually. So it's probably because of the circumstances in which I played it. So I don't know. I love Parasite Eve. I
think it's because you're a hipster, but that's just me.
Well, there's also that. But I try to keep that on the low.
I mean, the fact that you live in New York and you really like this game that's set in New York.
If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably Ozzy.
Oh God, that means I'm gonna grow out a man bun soon, right?
Yeah.
All right,
in any
Ozzy,
case,
your turn.
let me talk about what I have been playing lately, and it's nothing terribly exciting. I picked up not the most recent, but the ones that came before it, Need for Speed games, and Need for Speed is a series that I have a long-standing history with. I don't know if you guys are into it. I'm really into cars. That's kind of one of my other side hobbies. I just really like talking cars and the history of cars and rivalries between car makers and the like. And the Need for Speed series actually was the inception for my love of cars. My very first console games were Street Fighter Alpha and the Need for Speed, which was the original one, which is always something that bugs me. When young guns talk about Need for Speed, they always talk about the original one, and they're referring to Underground. And I almost want to reach out to them and choke them. And it just bugs the hell out of me, because I start going into that, sit down, young man, let me tell you about the real Need for Speed. But for me, the original one, if you guys recall, I don't know if you guys have played it either under 3DO or any of the other systems that it came out. I think it also came out for the Saturn. Yes, it did. And it had, I think, 8 to 10 cars. And it had a showcase of all these cars. And I got it when I was in Cuba. So it basically explained the history of the car makers. It explained the history of the car, the specifications, horsepower, 0 to 60, everything. And it had this really cool full motion video attached to it in which you could see the car in action. And one of the cars, I could probably tell you the car list off the top of my head, because all of those cars in some way or another became my favorites just because they were part of that game. And so my knowledge of cars as a kid growing up in Cuba that only knew 1958 Chevys and old Soviet Moskvich was very informed by Need for Speed. So regardless of whatever Electronic Arts has done ever since, Need for Speed has always held a very close place to my heart. And so I recently picked up the two other ones that recently came out. There was one called Need for Speed Rivals, which came out, I think, around the time of the PS4 release and the Xbox One release. And then there was one that was kind of a reboot that was just called Need for Speed, which is something that bugs me because you can't really tell it apart. Yeah. So this one came out in 2015, and it was kind of an underground remake. So I was going into it with very low expectations, and it's actually interesting. I played Need for Speed, the 2015 one, a little bit more, but I played it because it actually has, I'm not going to call it full motion videos, but it has live action. So it actually has real actors playing the characters. And even though it's very cheesy, it's very corny and cliched, and the characters are super stereotypical, and there's a guy with a hat and very hip clothes, and he's talking about how this jacket cost him $1,000, and
nice.
It's kind of very corny, but there's a part of me as a kid that grew up in the 90s that still loves live action in video games. And I don't know if you feel this way, Paul, but there's a part of me that always gets like a little bit of a twinge of glee when I see live action in video games. And this game kind of hit that itch a little bit. It scratched that itch a little bit, and I didn't think that I had that itch, but it did. And to be honest, they're not great games. I wish that I could say they were. They're open world, and they just kind of feel empty. They just don't feel like there's a world populating them. And because Need for Speed is now made by former Criterion staff, and Criterion were the developers of the Burnout series, they've kind of adopted a few of the burnout elements, such as crashes and the like, but it almost feels like window dressing. And it doesn't really feel like the games have an identity anymore. And it's really sad because I really wanted to like them. I still want to have kind of a Burnout, or at the very least, high class kind of elite, supercar racing game. But I just didn't see it with this game. I just didn't encounter it with these games.
I think the problem is that the Need for Speed series has, I don't want to say become obsolete, but they've had to reinvent it, because Gran Turismo and Forza came along, and suddenly every single racing game has to, they have to be different, right? You can't compete against Gran Turismo and Forza just on racing alone, because those games are so incredibly deep with such a huge roster of vehicles. And so Need for Speed needs to bring something like the open world element, or the live acting and so on. And it can, if it's one of those things where it's a fine line. If it's forced, it'll become kind of obvious, and it lacks kind of that intimacy of just having the 8 supercars and being really enthusiastic about that. Am I hitting the right notes here?
Yeah, I think so. But I also think there's a greater problem, which is that racing games other than Forza and Gran Turismo have really dwindled. I don't know why, but
because those games are better. There's just no, you cannot, as far as if you want a racing game, it's Forza, it's Gran Turismo, that's it, right? It's not even a matter of whether there are other ones. It's just that those games are so much better than everything else. It makes everything else obsolete. And that's why you're just not seeing that many. So if you're going to bring out a Need for Speed, it's got to be really different.
I think the problem for Need for Speed is twofold, at least in my mind, because my Need for Speed journey started with Underground and Underground 2. And those are pretty much the only ones that I've put any sort of significant time into. And at the time, I was the kind of person, I'm not super into cars. I like fast cars. The minutia of Gran Turismo was so boring to me. I could not be bothered at all. I did not get it. And Gran Turismo is an amazing series if you're really into cars and you're really into, getting the most out of any one vehicle. I would fall asleep. The thing that I liked about Need for Speed is its simplicity. It was pick your car, go race, go nuts. And I think the problem now is that they haven't really found a way to evolve that concept further. And I think that the amount of gamers who are into the sort of simple racing aspect of something like Need for Speed have moved on to Forza or Gran Turismo. So I think that Need for Speed has found a decreased player base, one, due to competition, because people are now more willing to put extra time into stuff like Forza and Gran Turismo, because the added depth is worth it if you put time into it. And so Need for Speed is just sort of more shallow by comparison. And they haven't really evolved past their, sort of initial offerings for a while now.
Well, and also Forza now has the regular Forza Motorsport and also Forza Horizon, which is a direct competitor with Need for Speed. So it's almost like, why do I need Need for Speed when I have Forza Horizon? Yeah. But I do lament the idea that there's so much less competition nowadays in the racing genre. I remember back in the 90s and the early 2000s, every developer had some kind of racing series. And Paul, maybe you haven't followed up with this, but in terms of racing studios, there have been so many that have closed down. And strangely enough, a lot of them came from the UK. And so many good studios have closed down and they've been absorbed. A lot of them have been absorbed by the Forza developers. So it's really unfortunate. And particularly the more arcadey type of racing games, those have kind of really...
Club, no more Burnout.
No. And I really lament that, because I really do like those games that are just about the fun and not the minutia of, grabbing a perfect turn on an apex. I love Gran Turismo, but sometimes Need for Speed just hits the right notes. And I also think there's another element, which you have touched upon in some sense, Arnie, which is that it's very difficult to develop a game where you don't really have a clear design goal. And Need for Speed kind of feels like a design by committee type of series at this point. They're just trying, okay, what are the kids into these days? All right, let's add it. Experience points, open world, and the like. And it just doesn't really have, it's a problem with almost every big AAA developer nowadays, where they just don't really have a clear vision of what they want their game to be. They're just kind of following trends. And in that context, I also want to mention Mass Effect Andromeda, which I recently played and then I quickly stopped. And it's also another Electronic Arts game. And it feels like there's the same issue. It just doesn't have a clear vision. And I think that's going to keep happening because you have teams of 200 developers that are just focused on their one specific task. And they're just, churning out games every year because they need to make their investor meetings. So I don't know. I mean, it was a disappointment. That's all I got to say.
And while that is true that you have a whole bunch of soulless games, I mean, we got to remember too that these games are based on a real activity in real life, right? Yeah. So you're going to have a ceiling of creativity, and B, any kind of offshoot of that real life activity, it's going to be niche by its very nature. Like when you look at something like a FIFA or a Pro Evolution Soccer game, the point is to simulate soccer, which you are familiar with. Like this is an actual activity, and so therefore, when you're playing it at home, generally speaking, you want it to be as realistic as possible. And if it's not, then it's not a good game. And the only way you can make a soccer game at this point to compete with Pro Evo or FIFA is to just take it in a completely different direction, like some kind of fantasy soccer or what have you.
It has to be like Mario Strikers or,
Thank you. That's like the perfect example, right? Like it's got to be like that. And so eventually when Gran Turismo figured it out, as far as, making the racing realistic, that was it. Like then it falls into the Madden and NHL situation, right? Where every year they're just trying to make it as more and more realistic as possible. And every once in a while you'll have sort of like a side quest, a Burnout 2 and that whole series, right? Where you have racing, but the racing kind of isn't the point. It's almost like a fantasy kind of racing. But the core activity that they're trying to ape and be as realistic as possible, that's always going to be the most popular one because people are familiar with this activity and they want to just relive it at home. At least that's what I think.
I agree. And also the car culture that built up around the time that Fast and the Furious came out has kind of died down. Absolutely. So I think there was a massive upsurge in interest in street racing, and that has kind of died down. I mean, kids are more interested nowadays in playing Fortnite and souping up their cars. You don't see a lot of racers out there anymore. It's just not something that has really taken a particular interest. There's also, when you see the Fast and the Furious franchise, they've kind of moved away from the street racing aspect of it almost completely. Yeah. So it's really just times are changing, and there's just not the same interest that used to be there before. We can move on now into the topic, the main topic of this episode, and that is 32-bit Squaresoft. And Squaresoft is kind of a juggernaut nowadays. They eventually, as I mentioned, they merged with Enix, who was another RPG juggernaut that was best known for the Dragon Quest series, and also a few other AAA series such as Valkyrie Profile and Star Ocean. And that was around 2003 when they merged. But before that, Squaresoft was already a juggernaut. And the 32-bit era was very good to Square. They had almost, I wouldn't say infinite money, but they had more money than they knew what to do with it. And it was still a very young developer that still didn't have a lot of corporate rules laid down. And so it was kind of the perfect moment for them to come into this area and just do wild things with it and just kind of innovate to their heart's content. And I want to make one thing clear, though. Even though Final Fantasy was probably, not even probably, it was the most significant aspect of Squaresoft, and it was the most important franchise for Squaresoft. I want to make clear that this is not a Final Fantasy episode, but I do understand fully that that's going to be a very hard distinction to make, and sometimes we're just going to end up talking about Final Fantasy for way too long, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah,
I don't mind it.
It's impossible not to.
Yeah, I don't mind it. I just want to make sure that we highlight a lot of the other lesser-known gems that are in the stable of 32-bit Squaresoft. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So what was Squaresoft? It's a Japanese developer. They were founded in 1986, and it was also a publisher. And they were best known for the Final Fantasy series, which was directed by a man called Hironobu Sakaguchi. And Sakaguchi is one of the legends of the field, together with others like Shigeru Miyamoto. Some other well-known public figures are Nobuo Uematsu, who was the composer for the Final Fantasy games and other games
Never
in
heard
Squaresoft. Never heard of them. I mean, who is that guy? And he's one of the most, I would probably say, the most important video game composer of all time. So I don't think that's a very wild statement. No. At least the most well-known composer in the video game field. Would you guys say so?
Absolutely. It's between him and like Tommy Tallarico, at least in the West, probably, as far as like
come on, man.
Names that people have heard of. Yeah.
No. I mean, Tommy Tallarico, the only thing I can think of is Earthworm Jim.
I'm not arguing that they're on the same level, but when you're talking to like general video game people, like, oh, what are names that you've heard? Like, you know, Tommy Tallarico is pretty well known. He has a video games live concert series that he does on the road like yearly. Like, the guy is known. I'm not saying that like him and Nobuo Uematsu are not in the same stratosphere, like not in the same galaxy, but you know, if you're asking me like well-known like video game composers, he's one of them.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Tommy Tallarico, I know him less for his video game composing rather than because of his outside game composing activities, such as video games live and the like. Yeah. The only score I can remember from him is Earthworm Jim. So that's why I kind of, you know, jumped at the idea
recoil of at the mention.
Yeah. I 100% agree, Ozzy. Like, for me, Tommy Tallarico means Electric Playground.
Yeah,
Electric Playground, which was a great series. It was actually the first review show that I actually watched.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was great. But in any case, we're getting a little bit out to left field here.
I guess I'll count that as my first controversial statement of the episode.
Yes, I would say that's probably the most controversial statement you made, you know, because you almost made me jump into the microphone and reach out to your neck and choke it.
I almost fell off my chair. I was like, Tommy Tallarico. Oh my God,
that was completely unexpected.
To say them.
I could have heard you say Yasunori Mitsuda or some other composer, but you went with Tommy Tallarico. Arnie, honestly, I'm just gonna put that as a strike against you. But let's take a step back. So you can't talk. You're in timeout for the next 5 minutes. So Square, circa 1995. I just want to set some of the background. The 90s as a whole were just a great time for Square. And Paul, you can talk about this. The SNES Super Famicom period for Square was amazing. They had the Final Fantasy games. They had Chrono Trigger. They had Secret of Mana. They had Super Mario RPG, which people don't realize that was a Square game that was done in joint collaboration with Nintendo. I mean, Paul, you can talk about this. The Super Nintendo era for Square was just amazing.
Well, that's where they cemented themselves as an elite developer, as far as I'm concerned. And I think part of it was also because they weren't that prolific during that time. During the PS1 era, they became super prolific, and that actually brought, you know, kind of a legendary status of its own for a different reason. But at least during the Super NES era, I mean, as far as I was concerned, a new Square release was a big deal and heavily anticipated. And that basically meant Final Fantasy. And obviously Chrono Trigger afterwards, right? So, I mean, you've got Final Fantasy II that kind of sets the table, or Final Fantasy IV if you want to call it that. And then once that's established as a legendary title for the system, the hype for Final Fantasy 3/6 is real. That comes out, it's incredible. And then Square is like the super elite developer. And at the time, you, as a kid, like, you're probably reading magazines, right? And just by virtue of reading through the magazines and reading what's going on in Japan, you see what, because the magazines were very, at the time, fond of citing what was popular in Japan and so on and so forth. And so even if Final Fantasy, for example, was successful in the West, in Japan, it was gigantic. And the magazines were very happy to tell you that. So, you know, games and the quality of the games aside, you were always kind of told that they were special, even if there weren't that many people into them in the West at the time. But then the PS1 comes along with Final Fantasy VII, and the game just changes completely.
And I think Square, with Final Fantasy 2/4, you said it, Paul, it really was a mission statement. It was really, this is us. This is what we want to do with video games. And we want to tell very mature storylines, and we want to have very complex characters, and we want it to dazzle you. We want to have great graphics, great music. I mean, Red Wings is one of the greatest all-time songs. I mean, am I wrong in that?
No argument here.
I mean, and so they kind of came in and put their foot down and said, this is what we should be working for. And when Final Fantasy 3/6 came out, I think that was really the apotheosis of RPGs of the SNES era. And to have that come out kind of contemporaneously with Chrono Trigger was one of the greatest 1-2 punches of video game history. So they really had a lot of, cachet at the time. And for video game enthusiasts, and Paul, you alluded to this, you always wonder what's out there in Japan, because they had the Romancing Saga series, they had Front Mission, they had Bahamut Lagoon, they had Seiken Densetsu 3, and you wondered, wow, I mean, if these games are great, what else could be out there in Japan that we're not getting? And it was almost like whatever you were fed from Square, you had to lap up, because you knew it was going to be quality.
Yep. Yeah, and by virtue of having so many other titles in Japan, and I mean, some might disagree, but we were getting the best ones. We were getting the cream of the crop, because they couldn't release everything in the West, right? So when we got, for example, Secret of Mana, you knew Secret of Mana was going to be the top choice out of their catalog.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And because of that, I think they had a lot of goodwill from video game enthusiasts, and they had a lot of money. They became very successful, and they had a joint kind of very good relationship with Nintendo, and all of these games came out on the Super Nintendo. I don't think they ever released a Genesis game, unless I'm mistaken.
Correct.
And Nintendo was kind of hand in hand, and I would dare to say it was one of the factors, not one of the biggest factors, but one of the factors that led to the success of the SNES. I would say the great RPGs it had that did not necessarily reflect in the Genesis. I mean, you had Phantasy Star in the Genesis, but it was not to the same level as the RPGs that were coming out on the SNES.
Not
it really
close.
made, excuse me?
Not even close.
Yeah, so if you wanted to play these RPGs, it really had to be on the SNES. So I think Nintendo benefited a lot from that. And to kind of go back to the history of Square around the time, about a year ago, there was an oral history of Final Fantasy VII where all the developers at the time kind of just talked about how Final Fantasy VII came to be. And you really get a lot of information about what the setting was like around this time in Squaresoft. And at the time, Nintendo was planning their Ultra 64, and that was the Nintendo, what was eventually the Nintendo 64. And honestly, for Squaresoft, they thought that was a logical fit. They were going to go and develop for the Nintendo 64 because they've had such a good relationship with Nintendo. And there was a Final Fantasy VI 3D tech demo that they did, which was kind of the goal that they wanted to hit in the next generation. And everyone kind of fell head over heels for that. But
It was
I think,
incredible, actually.
did you see it at the time?
Yeah, not the demo itself, but you saw screenshots of it in the magazines. And because magazines are what they are, it wasn't just like, hey, here's a couple of screenshots of this tech demo. It was new Final Fantasy for Nintendo 64 or Ultra 64, because that's what it was at the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, not a tech demo. This is the new game. This is coming. And I was like, oh my God, amazing. And then it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, and so it never happened. And I think from what I have seen and read from the contemporary anecdotes, is that they try to really work within the constraints of the Nintendo 64 and the cartridge system, and they just realized that the memory limitations were just too big, and the Nintendo 64 architecture just did not really lend itself to the ambition that they had, and polygons were a really big issue. They had a lot of difficulties implementing polygons into the games that they wanted to make, and this was an issue that propped up later on with all other Nintendo 64 games. If you realize, Nintendo 64 games are not really big on polygons. They're kind of very low on polygon count, and they just do a lot more with textures and the like.
But with that said, like Superman 64 was an absolute beautiful gem.
Oh yeah, I mean that was just, I mean what everyone, that was the benchmark really.
Absolutely.
So I think because of that, when Square looked at Nintendo 64, they said, I don't think this is really going to work out. And so from, hearing the developers tell you, one day Hironobu Sakaguchi walks in with a PlayStation shirt and he says, we're going to be developing for PlayStation now. We're not going to work for Nintendo anymore. And everyone was just kind of gobsmacked because they had been working on Nintendo 64 just the night before. But this was just kind of Sakaguchi's way of doing things. And since then, they've kind of said, this is the CD-based technology and the like. I think there are rumors out there that the relationship was kind of strained between Nintendo and Squaresoft. And I think there's an element of arrogance that Nintendo kind of had at the time, which, who would have thunk that with a Nintendo 64, right? Where they lost like all the third-party developers. I mean, one developer is bad, but when literally almost everyone just kind of jumped ship in the 32-bit era, that kind of shows you that maybe Nintendo was not going the proper route down, in that time period.
Oh, so many terrible decisions they made. Like, it's really staggering when you look back on it.
Oh, I mean, they lost so much ground. I mean, the PlayStation, they almost gave free reign to PlayStation to do whatever they wanted. Yeah. And it really was the perfect setting for PlayStation to come in and Sony to say, this is what we can offer. We can offer you unlimited possibilities, which of course nowadays in hindsight they were unlimited, but for a setting in which you had to live with the constraints of a cartridge, to have this CD-based technology in which you could just kind of go wild with full motion video and great audio and just do cutscenes and the like and implement cinematic perspectives, it really was kind of light years beyond what Nintendo was doing. And Nintendo felt that what they were doing was the right thing, and people were just kind of going on this crazy diversion that was just going to go the way of the 3DO. So they made a huge bet and they lost, unfortunately.
I mean, it wasn't in it. I guess it didn't help that PlayStation was also undercutting Nintendo 64 when it comes to game prices either. Cartridges are expensive, CDs not as much. So when you're looking at, either a $70 N64 game, or I think some of the PlayStation games came out as low as $40, is that right?
Yeah, yep. Yeah, some of them did.
So I mean, the choice is not that hard at that point.
Yeah, I mean, and to be honest, I mean, at the time, Squaresoft announced the defection from Nintendo via a TV commercial, which is almost kind of brutal when you think about it. Yeah. Especially
it's the LeBron James kind of way of doing it.
Yes. I mean, especially when you consider the context of Japanese developers, in which they're very conservative and they're very concerned with kind of saving face. That's pretty brash, to be honest. But they announced it through a TV commercial. And I almost want to say that Squaresoft was kind of the kingmaker. In the Super Nintendo era, they made Super Nintendo the king. And in the PlayStation era, lo and behold, they made PlayStation the king. I would venture as far as to say that Final Fantasy VII was the reason why the PlayStation was as successful as it was. Am I wrong?
It was the number one reason.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that.
It's probably, a very important reason. I think as far as king making, I think that it Square brought more to PlayStation than it did to the Super Nintendo, I think, because when they were putting games out on the Super Nintendo, RPGs were just starting to get big. People were just starting to sort of appreciate role-playing games. By the time that PlayStation comes around, there's a fan base already. So you can just start pumping these games out immediately, and, it just exploded after Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah, like I only half agree with that statement, because it wasn't that there was a fan base being made. There was, RPGs were popular, but I mean, platforming was still kind of the king.
Yeah.
But Final Fantasy came along, and it wasn't that Final Fantasy built on the existing growing fan base and appetite for RPGs. I would say Final Fantasy VII created it.
Yeah.
The fandom we see now for RPGs, from what I remember at the time, I can almost solely attribute that to Final Fantasy VII. It cannot be understated just how huge that game was.
Yeah. It made more RPG converts than probably any game in history.
That's my view of it, and I don't think that's incorrect.
Yeah.
And we also have to keep in mind, sorry to interrupt, Ozzy, but we also have to keep in mind, Sony releases the PlayStation. They have no original intellectual property. Nintendo has a murderer's row of it. Sony has nothing. They eventually created some. Twisted Metal was very popular, and they had others
Dragon,
as well.
Crash Bandicoot.
Exactly. But at the time, they had nothing. For Square to come along and bring over all their IP, man, Kingmaker is the word.
Yeah, I really do think, in 1996, PlayStation started getting the big guns. So that was when Resident Evil released. Yes. And I think that was the moment that, gamers really started seeing, okay, this system is onto something. And it also came out on the Saturn, but, the three people that owned it, played it.
Oh, and it was like a year later, too. It was like, okay, here's a little, here's a little thing we can give you, a little... I mean, I'm reasonably sure that what happened was that Capcom probably had some kind of contract where they had to make X amount of games for the Saturn. And Resident Evil was already a known property, probably fairly easy to port over relative to creating something new. And so it's like, all right, here you go, guys.
Oh, and it wasn't a great port either. But no. I think 1996 was really when the PlayStation started making its impact. And it was just before that Nintendo 64 came out. So... And the fact that when Nintendo 64 came out, they came out with Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings, and that's it. And there was nothing else for months. I mean, PlayStation just had the full field to itself. And that was the perfect setting for someone like Square to bring in what was, by all accounts, and really just an entirely mind-blowing, epic journey that you could not have witnessed before that time period. I mean, Final Fantasy VII was everything that an RPG gamer wanted in a game blown up to 100.
Yep.
It had cutscenes. It had a 3-disc storyline with 40 to 50 hours of gameplay. It had full motion video, not full motion video, but it had cutscenes and great Nobuo Uematsu score, very cinematic. I mean, it was just mind-blowing. I think that there's no other game that represented the leap in generation as Final Fantasy VII did.
Correct.
And it's really in this setting where Squaresoft really kind of built their 32-bit, they laid down their 32-bit framework, because with the success of Final Fantasy VII, it gave them a lot of money. It's still to this day one of the best-selling games of all time. I mean, it's still being released in its original form. I mean, there's a remake coming out in 2025 or something, but it's still being released in its original form and still being bought that way. And actually, it's a game that still holds up. There's been some backlash against Final Fantasy VII in recent years. I think it's still a great game. I think it's still terrific, to be honest.
I mean, the backlash against Final Fantasy VII is the same backlash that we see with any game that's, this revered and this, monumental. Obviously, when things like this happen in retrospect, people look back and say, oh, maybe it wasn't as great as we thought back then. I mean, but that doesn't automatically mean the game is bad.
No,
Yeah,
I can tell you, having lived through that period and been at the height of my video game fandom during that period, Final Fantasy VII was all that, maybe more.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to give you a little bit of a taste of how big it was, within 3 days of its release in Japan, the game sold 2,041,641 copies.
Yeah.
3 days. 3 days in Japan, of all places, which doesn't have a huge population.
Yeah.
So,
and I mean,
that
to be clear, I remember reading this in your notes and thinking that I had just seen an article maybe like a month or two ago that Persona 5 had just celebrated selling 1 million copies in a little under a year, I think.
Oh man, that's hilarious.
Yeah, it's really massive. And just to take a step back, Final Fantasy VII was released on September 7, 1997. So before this, Squaresoft released Tobal Number 1, which was a fighting game that we'll talk about in brief later on. But it wasn't a really big game. But really, Square made their mark with Final Fantasy VII in September of 1997. And it released before that, earlier that year in Japan, and everyone knew about it in the West. I mean, Paul, you can speak about this. The magazines were just going crazy over Final Fantasy VII, and Tobal Number 1 actually had a demo disc for Final Fantasy VII, and I think that's the reason why most people bought that game, because they just wanted to play Final Fantasy VII.
Yep, that's 100% correct. Tobal Number 1 was, I mean, I don't know, Ozzy, do you want to just start talking about the games now? We can start with Tobal.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, why not?
I mean,
Cue
Tobal
the
Number
Final
1 was, aggressively forgettable. Except for that Final Fantasy VII demo. Like, you're right, man. They put that demo in there, and it's like, oh, Tobal Number 1, eh? Maybe I want to give this a try.
Well, Tobal Number 1, that's a nice extra. At least I can play Final Fantasy VII demo.
Didn't they do that with Parasite Eve? Because didn't Parasite Eve have the Final Fantasy VIII demo in it?
Correct. And one of the great things that Squaresoft did around this time was that they would insert demos into their games that hyped up the other games that they were releasing. And that's actually how I got to know some of the other games that they were releasing, even in Cuba. Because in Cuba, just to give you some background, you didn't really get game magazines. You didn't get any of this means through which you found out about games that were out there. So whenever you got a game, whatever was contained within that case was your entire world of gaming collapsed into that very small package. And so Squaresoft, they had a lot of hype for their other games within those, and they had the demo disc. So that was the reason, for example, that I found out about Parasite Eve. So I knew about Parasite Eve through that. And that's something that it can't be understated how important it was, because nowadays we have downloadable demos and the like, or honestly, games are so cheap nowadays that you could just pick up the game without having to worry about the demo. But back in the day, demos were a big thing. And particularly in the PlayStation era, they had their own kind of demo compilations and the like. And that was how I got to know about games. And so Squaresoft was kind of at the forefront of that in just presenting their games to a broader audience and kind of assisting their other titles by way of their big releases. And I think that was genius on their part.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, hey, it works with cocaine dealers, right? Just give them a taste.
Yeah. Give them a taste. Give them a taste to hook them.
I'm not entirely sure that's the business model they were trying to emulate there.
Isn't it though, Arnie? I don't know. I think we have a good argument here.
I had to go with Paul, Arnie. I really do have to go with Paul. But Tobal number one, I mean, it was an interesting concept. I'm not going to put down the game too much. It's not a game that has aged very well. I really do think aggressively forgettable is a perfectly appropriate word. It didn't have like shaded polygons or anything like that, so it looked very bland.
Yeah.
And it had a lot of cool ideas. I mean, it was designed by Akira Toriyama, who was a Dragon Ball Z creator. So it had kind of that Akira Toriyama Dragon Ball Z type look. So that was a big thing for people.
Sort of Dragon Quest aesthetic as well.
Yeah. But the problem was that illustration did not translate to the very ugly polygons that were in the game. And so the game had a very weird grappling fighting system. And I thought that when I played it, it didn't work very well. It also had this kind of quest mode, which was almost like an RPG, like a dungeon, almost like a roguelike of sorts, like a very early roguelike of sorts, which was like randomly generated dungeons. And it was interesting. I mean, the idea of a fighting game having an RPG within it was kind of interesting, but it was so repetitive and samey and so bland that I think it ultimately was very forgettable. And there was a sequel released, Tobal 2, which never came out in North America. And I think the big calling card for that sequel was that you could play with like around 600 characters. I'm not even overstating that.
I did have Tobal 2 actually from back in the day. Because back in the day, we all had modified PlayStations and we would just get a million copied games and play everything, right?
Yeah.
And Tobal 2 was a known quality. Like, it was a game we had heard about through the magazines, and everybody was saying, oh my god, it's amazing, I can't believe they're not releasing it here. And you know what, man? Tobal 2, that game was the real deal. Like, for all the ugly graphics in Tobal 1, Tobal 2 looks way better. And the fighting system was a lot of fun. The fact that you had the quest mode and you could unlock all these stupid characters, like, it's tempting to be like, 200 characters, like, how different can they be? How good can they be? And you would be right in thinking that, a lot of palette swaps and a lot of stuff like that. But there still was a whole ton of, like, original characters. And as Guardian Heroes demonstrated, sometimes playing with shit character against shit character is kind of a fun change of pace. It was a really interesting diversion. And one more thing about Tobal 2. As far as I remember, it was the first game where when you win and your character does like a win pose, you could actually press different buttons to make them say different things. Oh. And using the DualShock controller, you could actually move their eyeballs. So I know, like, it sounds completely ridiculous, but like...
It sounds amazing.
Dude, hours of fun. Because, like, the camera zooms in on the winner, and then you hit the button, and they say Japanese nonsense, and you're moving the stick around in circles, and their eyes are just kind of, like, moving around, and you can control each eye individually, and we just laugh and laugh and laugh.
That sounds great.
Tobal 2, great game, and brought the intangibles.
Yeah, and let me take a step back. Tobal 1 and 2 were created by Dream Factory, which was a studio founded by Seiichi Ishii, who was the designer of Tekken 1 and 2, and also one of the guys that worked on Virtua Fighter. So he was kind of a known quantity, so he jumped ship from Namco, and he formed Dream Factory. And so Tobal number 1 was their first fighting game. And so, it's a little bit belied by the fact that Tobal number 1 was so bland, but there was some pedigree behind the series. So it wasn't like this was... a couple of young guns trying to come up with a game. There was a lot of pedigree, and I think Square had big ideas for the game because they had Akira Toriyama, who had also just worked on Chrono Trigger for Squaresoft, and they had this guy who was kind of doing his own thing in his independent studio and already had proven that he was a good designer. So the fact that Tobal 2 didn't come out in the US was kind of surprising.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a shame, and doubly so because they released Erguys here instead, when Tobal 2 was really the one that we deserved. Erguys, I mean, I don't know. Did you guys ever play it?
I played it, man, and I'm going to disagree aggressively on that. I love that game. I love Erguys. And I think the big thing about Erguys, and we're probably jumping a little bit ahead in years, It was released in April 30th of 1999 in North America. It's very similar to the Tobal games, but it also has more of a focus on wrestling mechanics. But I think the big thing that it had was that it featured Square characters. So
Yes.
Final Fantasy VII characters. So it featured Cloud, it featured Sephiroth, and Tifa. And that for people was just mind blowing that you could
huge
play with
selling
them.
point.
Oh, totally. And it was done in collaboration with Namco, so it also had almost like a Tekken feel to it a little bit. But for me, when I played Guys, and I played it, I think around circa 2000 or so, and it was the quest mode. I think Guys had the perfectly realized quest mode, the evolution of the quest mode in Tobal number 1 and 2. And it was just massive. Like, you actually had items you picked up and the like, and you progressed through all these massive levels. And with an arena fighting, system built into it. So I loved it, dude. I love Guys. And I really think that it was a good game, and it was very innovative because it was not something that you typically associated with Squaresoft. You didn't associate
good.
fighting games with Squaresoft.
Yeah, no. So, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it was bad. I had it. I enjoyed it. The quest mode was absolutely fantastic. Just Tobal 2 was a cut above. That's all there is to it, really. Not that Guys was bad, but man, Tobal 2 was incredible.
I have to play it, and I have to admit that I have never played it. But Arnie, have you played either Tobal or Guys?
No. So my start in the PlayStation sort of life cycle was very late, I think, by comparative standards. I mean, I was born in 91, late 91. So when these games are coming out, I'm 6, 7. I don't really think I started playing PlayStation games proper until maybe 2001, 2002. So I missed the boat on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. No, I mean, I really think that the Dream Factory games, they're very quirky. That's the word I would put to them. They're not typical fighting games. And if you're coming in expecting a Tekken or expecting a Soul Calibur or even Street Fighter, you're not going to get that from them.
Yeah.
But they have a certain charm to them. Maybe not Tobal number 1. Tobal number 1 I find to be very bland, but we've gone over that.
Yeah.
But it was just cool that Squaresoft was embracing this other entirely different genre, but putting its own spin on it. And I think that's really what I love about Squaresoft from this era, that they did traditional genres with their own RPG spin to it. And to me, that was just fantastic. So and Final Fantasy VII was a hit, and because it was a hit, it allowed them to really do a lot of crazy things with their games, and it really gave a spotlight to their other games. And so I think the next big game that they released was Saga Frontier 1, and coming off Final Fantasy VII, I think Saga Frontier 1 was a big change, and almost a brusque change that players were not really expecting, because, as you said, Paul, the players that came into the genre at this era, they really thought that RPGs were all this cinematic, epic masterpieces. And let it not be said, I mean, Saga Frontier is an epic, but it certainly was no Final Fantasy VII. And it was released in March of 1998 in North America, and it was directed and produced by Akitoshi Kawazu, who was the original battle mechanic designer for Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy II. And the Saga series, they have a long storied history. They go back to the Final Fantasy Adventure games on the Game Boy, and then they had the Romancing Saga games that didn't come out in the United States. And Saga Frontier was the next game that came out in the United States after Final Fantasy Adventure 3, which was the last Saga game that came out here.
Yeah.
And they're very weird games. They're very, very weird games. They're very obscure in its battle mechanics. They're very Byzantine in how they explain their systems to the players. They're not necessarily intuitive. And for a gamer that was coming off the heels of Final Fantasy VII to walk into Saga Frontier, there was almost a bit of disappointment, I would say. And I think Saga Frontier 1 felt that backlash.
Yeah,
but
it did 100%.
What do you think, Paul? What do you think, Paul?
No, I completely agree with you. I had... we all, back then, we took a look at Saga Frontier, and there was a collective snort Like, what are we doing here, guys? Come on. We just had Final Fantasy VII. Now you're giving us this garbage? And I mean, I had a buddy back then. Well, actually, we're still friends today. He was the guy who played all the weird RPGs and would be like, "You guys have to play Persona," and I'm like, "Persona? Pff, come on, man." and he's like, "Saga Frontier, dude, Saga Frontier. That's the game to play." And I'm like, "You're crazy. That game looks like shit." And looking back on it now, I kind of wish I had given it more of a shot. But definitely the collective mentality at the time was Final Fantasy VII looks like the game of tomorrow. Saga Frontier looks like the game of yesterday. I do not yet want to go back to yesterday. I mean, now that I'm an old man, I like going back to yesterday. But back then, nah.
And it was funny because it really did have pedigree. I mean, Akitoshi Kawasu had a lot of cachet in Square at the time, which is why they gave him free reign over this series and whatever he wanted to do. And also, Koichi Ishii, who was the director of the Seiken Densetsu games, or Mana, was the planning chief. So he was also involved. And just to take a step back, the Saga games are kind of known for their non-linear nature. They have what is called the free scenario system, or that's how they term it, which is basically you have 7 characters and they all have their own individual storylines. And basically, they're just very different storylines altogether. And so it made for a very disjointed feeling game. And I don't think people necessarily wanted that at the time. People wanted a tight, epic storyline and not 7 broken out characters with different storylines that didn't necessarily tie together. So I would say in that sense, it was a little bit ahead of its time. It's something that I think is embraced more nowadays. But at the time, people were just wondering, what the hell? I'm not sure I'm into this. And that was a part of the criticism of the game at the time. And again, it really did feel, like you say, Paul, like a game of yesterday. So, Arnie, did you play this game?
So, Saga Frontier is interesting. I've never played it, but of all the games on this list, it's probably the one that I most want to play. It just seems like weird enough for me to really like it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting title in the Square canon. And the game also was famously unfinished. There is a battle. There's one of the storylines where it literally ends in the middle of the boss fight. Literally, the game just ends in the middle of the boss fight. Yeah, I mean, and this is kind of like the most salient example of an unfinished game. And I think from what they've said is because of time limitations. They just didn't have enough time. But, regardless, the game sold well. And I think a lot of that was because of Final Fantasy VII. And the game did have a sequel, Saga Frontier 2. And that sequel kind of atoned for the sins of the predecessor. Because it's a beautiful, strikingly beautiful game. I don't know if you guys have seen this game in action, but it is absolutely gorgeous. Paul?
Hearing about it now, I wish I had. But the reputation at the time of Saga Frontier meant that when Saga Frontier 2 came up, we didn't even bother. Like, it was just like, I'm not even going to bother looking at this. I'm not going to be fooled. I was fooled the first time. You can put your Saga Frontier 2 away. I think there's a Final Fantasy VIII over there that I'd like to play instead.
And I think that was also the problem. I mean, in the US, I don't think the Saga games had a very good reception, but they were pretty big in Japan, actually. And Saga Frontier 1 and 2 sold very well in Japan. But Saga Frontier 2 had this beautiful watercolor graphics that felt like they were hand-painted. And it was actually produced by actually doing hand drawings and scanning it and digitizing it into the backgrounds and character sprites. So it really had a look that no other game had. And it came out late enough in the life cycle of the PS1 where it just kind of went under the radar for a lot of gamers. But I actually have a lot of interest in playing this game, and I'm a sucker for hand-drawn graphics. And
One thing I did want to say is that I find it funny, or at least entertaining, that after getting so much flack, these games for their sort of graphical stylings, they probably look better on these modern televisions than any of these Final Fantasy games. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love playing Parasite Eve, but playing it on a flat screen TV is making my eyes bleed. It does not look great.
Want me to tell you the secret? I played Parasite Eve on the PSP.
Oh.
And that was the greatest decision I could make because it compressed the graphics down to the point that it felt much sharper.
Yeah.
Whereas if you blow it up to a widescreen TV, it just looks like shit.
Yeah.
Honestly.
I mean, the pixels are the size of my fist. Like,
yeah,
it doesn't look great.
So I would say that yes, hand-drawn games have aged in terms of graphics a lot better than the polygonal games. And so that's also why I'm interested in the Saga games. These games are not very expensive nowadays, so I would say that if you're interested, just go and pick them up and see what they're about. The Saga Frontier games have been released on the PlayStation Network in Japan, but they haven't been released here. But you could just pick them up. And
this series had PS2 entries as well, didn't it?
Yes, they did, and that was actually when they went off the rails, actually. And that's when Akitoshi Kawasu was just kind of put into a limbo in Square because they realized, okay, you've done enough. We can put you back into the bar now. So yes, Unlimited Saga is one of the most criticized games of all times. I can't really speak about it from any personal perspective, so I'm not going to say much about it. But yes, they were on the PS2. But going back to 1998, when Saga Frontier 1 came out, 1998 was a big year for Square. And that was a year where kind of all their games kind of really coalesced and came out. So Parasite Eve came out that year, and it came out on September 9, 1998. And I think we've already talked about that game at length. And just to summarize, great game, great graphics, great music. Go play it. It's very short, but that's a good thing nowadays. But another one of their great games that came out that year was Xenogears. And I don't know if you guys have played Xenogears. I have a long history with Xenogears. And that was another game that showed how crazy Squaresoft was at the times and how willing they were to give their developers and designers free rein to do whatever they wanted. And it was a game that was almost not released in North America because of how much in terms of religious allusions and the like it had in the game. But it really is a game that I don't think we have had something like that since, in how ambitious, even if it failed at points, it was extremely ambitious in what it was trying to achieve in terms of this massively epic storylines that dealt with Jungian and psychoanalysis, Freudian conceits, and religious allusions from Judeo-Christian backgrounds, mixed with mecha and robots and an RPG and martial arts and the like. It really was just something that you had never seen before. So
yeah, it was an all-you-can-eat of good stuff, right? Between the martial arts and the mecha and the complex storyline. I agree with you, Ozzy. It's well loved and with good reason. I actually did play it. Big surprise, right? But I did play it back then, and I had to stop, I think, about a third of the way through, which at the time for me was like unheard of. If I'm a third of the way through an RPG back then, I'm probably finishing that RPG, right? But Xenogears, and I just from doing this podcast, and I wonder if this is something that anybody else out there relates to, because it feels like I'm the only one. Xenogears, the gigantic flaw for me that kept me from playing it is that there was a lot of dialogue, and you couldn't fast forward through it, and you couldn't adjust the message speed and the options. So whenever you're sitting through conversations, like, the words are coming up letter by letter, and they're coming up really slowly, and you can't hit X to make it go faster.
Yeah.
So after a while, I was like, I can't deal with this anymore. Like, I'm just waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, which, would have been fine if I hadn't seen other games where I could just hit X and go through it more quickly, because, I don't read at a second grade level.
Yeah, I think Xenogears is a massively flawed game. I played it back in 1999, and again, it was one of my first RPGs when I got to this country, because I got to this country in September of 1999, and I played Xenogears maybe 2 months after that, in around November, which was a great time period for Square.
Yeah,
and I think it's it's a very flawed game. The game is very unbalanced. You have to grind a lot. The random battles are excessive, and the game has this difficulty spikes that are completely unforeseen, and so you have to replay it over and over again. And particularly with the message speed concern that you just raised, Paul, it can become very grinding and punishing.
Yes.
And so I stopped playing the game because of that, because at one point I just hit a wall with this boss, and I just had not leveled up enough. And so I had to go back and spend hours of grinding just to be able to beat this boss. And so I gave up on it. But I was still so enthralled by the idea of this game, particularly because it had anime cutscenes, which is not something that you saw at the time, other than the Lunar series maybe.
Yeah.
And I love those anime cutscenes. And the idea that it was a mixture of mechs and your player characters, it just really was really cool. So, Ani, did you play Xenogears?
I skipped to the much superior Xenosaga.
I think that's wrong, but I'll take it. I think that's wrong, but I'll accept it.
I would say Xenosaga is superior. It's not even. Look, you're kind of. It's not like they're all-time great games, Xenosaga and Xenogears, and I think Xenogears is perhaps seen more, or is perhaps remembered more fondly, because of the era and because of the developer.
Yeah.
Xenosaga comes out during the PS2 era, and it's developed... Jesus Christ, was it developed by Namco?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I thought it was a great game, and I thought it was a little bit more balanced than Xenogears, but it's remembered less fondly. That's fine.
Yeah. I was being partially facetious because I haven't played Xenogears. But no, it's a game I've heard a lot about, and, basically raising the same concerns that you guys have been talking about. It just seemed like a game that was ambitious beyond its means. And so definitely one that I want to visit, but lower on my list than some of the other Squaresoft games I haven't been able to play.
It's a very divisive game, and for what it's worth, I think it has the best soundtrack that Yasunori Matsuda ever composed. I really do wholeheartedly believe that. Maybe Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross are the only competitors in that field, but I really do think that it's a mixture of Celtic music with very folksy string sounds, and I really do think that it's a wonderful little soundtrack. So for what it's worth, that's one of the best parts about it. It's a very divisive game. Even back when it came out, it was very divisive. Some publications loved it, other publications hated it. I remember GamePro gave it like a 2.5 out of 5 or a 2.0, which for GamePro, who hyped everything, that was really bad. So it's still to this day a very divisive game. And the main director of the game, Tetsuya Takahashi, he went on to form Monolith Soft, and they did Xenosaga, which was published by Namco. And then they did Xenoblade, which just recently released, Xenoblade Chronicles 2. So they're all kind of tied to the same world, but they're just kind of spiritual sequels, not necessarily direct sequels. And they all kind of follow very similar themes. I don't think any of them have quite reached the ambition of the original Xenogears. Yeah. So, but it did end up being a popular game, and for a time, Xenogears was actually, the original release was actually fairly rare. And then Squaresoft released a Greatest Hits version, which kind of brought it to the hands of many others. But moving on from Xenogears, 1998 also saw the release of Final Fantasy Tactics. And this was also coming off the heels of Final Fantasy VII, and that was released early in the year of 1998. And it was directed by Yasumi Matsuno, who was also known for the Tactics Ogre series, and it was a strategy RPG. But I'm not gonna talk about this. I'm gonna just let Paul talk about this because I
Dude,
think Paul may be a fan of this game.
You brought it up. You mentioned Final Fantasy Tactics, and I physically like went into a crouch like a cat. Like, I can't fucking wait to talk about this game. Like, dude, Final Fantasy Tactics, like, I have a personal, like, top 5 favorite games ever. Final Fantasy Tactics number 4. Like, that game
that high, huh?
that friggin' high. Like, it just hit all the right notes as far as I was concerned. I mean, the game itself wasn't anything, look, it wasn't anything terribly new. You still had other tactical RPGs. You had your Ogre Battle and your Tactics Ogre and so on and so forth. But Final Fantasy Tactics just brought it to another level, really heavily refined it. And it also had something else gameplay-wise that I really like in my games, which is that it allowed you to break it. Like, you could make that game very, very easy if you kind of knew how to manipulate the job classes and so on. And for those of you who have played it and know what I know what you're thinking. You're thinking about the Mathematician. The Mathematician in that game is a class where you can cast any spell, basically, and you don't target characters within, you don't target enemies within, like, you know, a field of view or a certain amount of spaces away. You can target any amount of characters as long as they respond, or as long as they correspond to a number, right? So with your Mathematician, you would select the number 5, and then it would hit all characters, including your own, with the level of a multiple of 5, or HP a multiple of 3, or something like that. And eventually, when you max out your Mathematician, you could select any kind of different number or permutation to the point where you're targeting 90% enemies and 0 of your guys. So you start off a fight, you immediately just paralyze all your enemies, and then have at it. And it sounds ridiculous, and it is ridiculous. And that's part of the charm of that game, is that it can totally be broken. Or not, right? Because that kind of thing takes a little bit of time, takes a little bit of grinding. Mm-hmm. The storyline at the time was more, I mean, Final Fantasy VII, yeah, it's epic, and the story is well loved. Final Fantasy Tactics was far more adult. There was more drama, more betrayal.
Intrigue.
Pardon?
More intrigue.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's the case. You know, the music it's easily my favorite soundtrack of the PS1 era. Like, again, if you've played it, you know what I'm talking about. The soundtrack is freaking incredible. That game, man, I remember borrowing my buddy's PlayStation because he couldn't stop talking about how good that game was. And I still had a Saturn at the time. I didn't have a PS1. But we would trade systems back and forth, right? And I remember borrowing that PlayStation and playing Final Fantasy Tactics. I did not want to give it back. And eventually when I got a PS1, it was one of the first games that I did end up getting for it. It's fantastic.
And it introduced the Yasumi Matsuno style of storytelling,
yes,
which is very almost Shakespearean, I would say. There's a lot of political intrigue and a lot of changing alliances and the like, and it introduced the setting of Ivalice, which would later show up in Vagrant Story and then in Final Fantasy XII, both of which were directed by Yasumi Matsuno. And it was just a very different setting. It was medieval, fantasy, but it felt almost grounded, really. Unlike other games of his time, it felt like a very real, grimy setting. And I think that was kind of refreshing for the time. And also, I don't think that the strategy RPG genre really had a presence up until Final Fantasy Tactics. And because it had the Final Fantasy moniker attached to it, it really brought strategy RPGs to a whole other field of players that were coming off the heels of Final Fantasy VII. Because at this point, everyone just wanted whatever was Final Fantasy labeled, they just slapped it up. Yeah. So it really was kind of like a Trojan horse, the Final Fantasy name, where it just introduced strategy RPGs to a whole subset of players. And a lot of what Final Fantasy Tactics did became staples of the strategy RPG genre. And it went on into like the Disgaea series and all this other great strategy RPG series that are now well known. And Final Fantasy Tactics to this day is still kind of revered as probably the best strategy RPG game of all time.
Yeah.
I have no qualms about that. I don't think there's really any doubt about it. Another nice thing about it that's kind of underrated is that it's still very playable today. It doesn't have the ugly, blocky polygon characters. It has 3D backgrounds and, you know, textures on the ground and so on and so forth, 3D buildings. But the characters are all sprites, and the sprites are surprisingly evocative. You know, for their use in storytelling, it's really good. It's aged really well. I wholeheartedly recommend it. Like, as someone who's played other tactical RPGs since then, Disgaea, you know, that brings something different to the table. We're not going to get into it, but Tactics brought just the right amount of everything, just the right amount of replay value with all the different job classes, perfect amount of difficulty. Although it was kind of flawed, I have more than one friend who either gave up on the game completely or had to start a new game entirely, because there is one part in the game where you can save and you can't go back, and you face a boss who is really kind of overpowered. And I don't know if you guys have heard of what I'm talking about. It's like 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through, and it is a bit of a kick in the nads. I remember facing this guy and being like, "What the fuck?" And I couldn't go back. Like, you can't go back and grind, right? You just kind of have to figure it out.
Yeah.
I did beat him, but some of my friends were not so lucky. Like, I looked at their party, and I'm like, "You guys are fucked. Just you're gonna have to start over."
You can just start the game over again right now.
Yeah, and that, unfortunately, that's a huge flaw. And if I was a game reviewer, I couldn't give it a 10 out of 10. Sorry, Masa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, and I've talked about this before, but I always remember Final Fantasy Tactics because it was the game. I remember going to Toys R Us when I was probably 10, and I had to choose between Final Fantasy Tactics and Legend of Dragoon. And I ended up picking Legend of Dragoon. So in an alternate universe, I could have been as cool as Paul. And yet now here I sit, a lowly wretch who likes Tommy Tallarico and fucking played Legend of Dragoon as a kid.
But Legend
Your life
of
would have been
Dragoon
much
was pretty
different.
good. Like, you can't... I'm not going to say... As a kid, you can't go wrong either way with those.
Yeah. But since then, I have played Final Fantasy Tactics. I've never beaten it, but I have played it in one of its many different forms. And it's, you know, it's extremely enjoyable, super deep, extremely deep, almost intimidatingly so. At least for me, in terms of the job classes and customizability of your party and all that stuff. So I could definitely see where it would scratch that strategic itch for people. And the story is great. Like Ozzy said, sort of Shakespearean in its narrative, but grounded in a certain sense. So I really enjoyed it. I do need to finish it one of these days. But you know, of the tactical role-playing game genre, probably the flag bearer for that, as far as getting it into the hands of you know, the casual gamer and sort of blowing it up.
And you can't save unless I'm totally mistaken, and I don't think I am. You can't actually save during the maps. Yeah. So it also has that factor where, you know, every once in a while you'll have a miracle that goes in either direction, where you attack your enemy and you've got a 90% chance to hit, and then you miss and it completely fucks you. Yeah. Or, you know, you're down and out and you have a 10% chance to hit this guy, so you go for it and it hits, and you have that, you know, that's a very rewarding kind of you know, game thing. Boy, mechanic. Am I ever missing my words here.
Yeah.
Mechanic. Thank you. Mechanic is the word that I'm looking for.
Yes. And honestly, that's probably it, not just in Final Fantasy Tactics, but it just tactical RPGs in general. That's probably the thing that makes me put them down more than anything else, because there's nothing more frustrating to me than spending, 30, 40, an hour on a single map to have one thing go wrong and sort of cascade into utter destruction and lose, and then have to do the whole thing over again.
See, but how often does that happen in a game where you have like stakes and you have to be super careful? That's
Paul,
what I'm saying.
Paul, you're just a masochist, just admit it. That's really what it comes down to.
I wish I could say that I was the General Patton of Final Fantasy Tactics, but I'm not. So quite often in my case.
Well,
guys, I remember, and sorry, Ozzy, I'm kind of hijacking things here a little bit, but like, I remember playing Final Fantasy Tactics. I had some friends over, and I had a buddy who was like, you got to use the monk. The monk is the secret to this game. And I'm like, dude, the monk is garbage. What are you talking about? And he's like, watch. And he starts a level and he has a monk and he just starts like attacking everything with the monk. And it's all like 20% to hit, 30% to hit. And he never misses. And he's like, see, dude, the monk. And I'm like, no, you're so lucky. You're so full of shit. He's like, nah, man, the monk. Walks up to another character, 30%, kills it. I'm like, you're full of shit. But, little things, a lot of memories of that game. It's fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, I just want to, I know we took a little bit long in Final Fantasy Tactics, but it's a game that merits that amount of time. It's really, I think to this day, one of the most revered games in the pantheon of RPGs. I just want to round out 1998 a little bit. One of the other games that came out that year was Einhander, which was a shooter, a shmup. And that was released in May 5, 1998. And it's something that is very, very different from every other Squaresoft game that came before it. It was a futuristic Blade Runner style type shoot 'em up and heavy on the neon signs. It had a very techno aesthetic and a soundtrack that matched it in that sense. It had 2.5D graphics, massive bosses. I love this game. Did you guys play it?
No,
yeah,
I
did.
Because I don't play anything good until it's absurdly expensive.
It is expensive, unfortunately.
This is like the second. This is the set behind Saga Frontier. This is probably the second one I want to play.
Well, a pro tip for you: the Japanese one is super, super cheap. It has a way nicer cover, and it's very, very playable. Like I would recommend that if you really want to play it and you really want like a physical copy of it. Yeah. Go with the Japanese one. Like it's really cool. And the game itself it's really good. Like, I mean, it's a shoot 'em up, so, there's only so much innovation you can have there. But a really good example of the time, I mean, Square was just developing everything. They were just like, we're just going to do this and we're going to do it our way. And it's going to be really cool. And by the way, we're Squaresoft.
Yeah, and they just have free reign to do whatever they wanted with the money. And they had a lot of hits. And Einhander was one of those games that just kind of came out of left field. And I don't think a lot of people played it. But it was one of those that if you played it, you kind of remembered, because it was around the time that the Fifth Element came out. And the Fifth Element had like the flying cars. And the enemies in Einhander had those kind of same flying car type of aesthetic. So everyone kind of called it the Fifth Element game because it had a very, very similar aesthetic. And so I think for those that played it, it was really indelibly tied to those times. But I just want to move on from that. Another game that came out in 98 was Brave Fencer Musashi. I don't have a lot to say about this game, but I do know that it has a very big fan following. It's a very cult fan following type game. And it came out in October 98. And it was their first fully polygonal RPG. And it was kind of an action RPG with a sword-based combat and the like. I never played it. I have it. I've never kind of put it in. Did you guys have any experience with this?
Not this one.
No.
Yeah, like, I mean, even for me back then with Infinite Time, still only so many games. And from what my friends told me, Brave Fencer Musashi was, not the greatest game. The fact that it has like such a huge cult following now, I shouldn't even say huge. It has such a fervent cult following now. Actually makes me wonder about it. But ultimately, I had no interest in it at the time myself.
Yeah. In what I'm realizing is a developing pattern for these games. I have no experience with Brave Fencer Musashi, but a friend of mine who's a big sort of RPG player back in the PS2, PS1 era really loved the PS2 sequel that I had no idea was a thing until I saw him play it.
What game is that? I've never heard of this either.
Oh,
Yeah. I forgot the name of it, but it was directed by Tetsuya Nomura.
Yeah.
Who was the character designer for Final Fantasy VII and the like, and he also designed the Brave Fencer Musashi characters, and he directed the sequel. So that came out in the PS2 era. But I think we can skip over Brave Fencer Musashi because we have so many other big titles to talk about.
No,
so
let's keep talking about how we've never played it and know nothing about it.
Yeah. Let's move on to 1999, and I think the big game that year was Final Fantasy VIII. And guys, this game was so hyped. After Final Fantasy VII, people wanted the next sequel. They were just frothing at the mouth. Square, give us what we need. And Final Fantasy VIII came out in September 9, 1999, which is also the same day that the Dreamcast came out in North America. Just to put into perspective,
just another kick in the balls to Sega.
Oh yeah. I mean, Sega just couldn't freaking get a win here, man. The budget was.
I would say the Dreamcast was a win, at least for a while.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
I was working at EB Games at the time, and let me tell you, nobody was talking about Final Fantasy VIII.
Yeah.
Everyone was talking about the Dreamcast?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. But I just remember because, and I don't know if this is a trend for Sega, but I also know that when they released the 32X, that was the same day that Donkey Kong Country got released. And now seeing that Final Fantasy VIII got released the same day as the Dreamcast, I don't know. It just seems like people were trying to like step on Sega a little bit.
It's almost like they were competing.
How about that the original Sega, it wasn't called the Master System, the SG-1000 came out the same day as the Famicom. So I don't know why Sega likes to do this, but I don't think it bore out well for them, I would venture to say, considering that they're no longer in the hardware business. But who am I to say? But Final Fantasy VIII was a big deal. It was a really big deal. I mean, I remember it at the time. There was actually like a Pizza Hut promotion where you got a demo of the disc if you bought a pizza, and Final Fantasy VIII was one of the demos. And that song that initially played, Liberi Fatali, were with the cutscenes and Squall kind of riding, across the sea. I was blown away, and I said, I want to play this game. And if Final Fantasy VII was kind of realist, Final Fantasy VIII was even more realist in its style.
Yes.
And I think that proved divisive. I think to this day, it's one of the most divisive games in the Final Fantasy canon. But it can be understated that it was massive at the time. And just to put it into perspective, the budget at the time, if you account for inflation, it's $24 million with a team of 180 developers. That for the time, it really is massive. So,
yeah.
And it's sold super well, and it was very critically acclaimed. It just hasn't aged well in terms of its critical opinion.
Yeah, I think of the three PlayStation Final Fantasies, at least, this is the one that people seem to like the least now.
And
I think
undeserved.
A lot of it, and I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Ozzy, because I'm not entirely sure on this, but I think a lot of it has to do with the mechanics of it, like the junctioning system and the drawing magic and all that stuff that sort of seemed to bog down the once more simple sort of Final Fantasy combat system.
Correct. And it unnecessarily reinvented the wheel.
Yeah.
And people were not okay with that. But I also think that people were not okay with the fact that there really wasn't a villain in the game. I mean, you had Ultimecia and the like, but people were just not drawn into the narrative, whereas with Final Fantasy VII, you had Sephiroth. And that was such an epic villain that when you go into Final Fantasy VIII, it just felt like a step down in terms of quality. And Squall was seen as kind of just a solemn, gloomy character. It was more of really, when you really think about it, it's kind of like Harry Potter for Final Fantasy. It was a bunch of kids that are in this school, they're going to the school and they're training to be soldiers, and they ride around in this spaceship that also doubles as a school, or I guess a school that doubles as a spaceship. So I think because of that, it just was kind of weird for gamers. So some people freaking swear by this game. I mean, some people swear by this game and they love it. But it really has been one of the most divisive games in the Square pantheon. And for me, what completely made that game was Eyes on Me, which is still the best damn song ever made.
Stop the madness.
I'm being very facetious because I hate that song so freaking much.
Stop the madness.
It's so bad. It's so bad. But it was one of the first games that had that.
Yeah.
That had an actual tie-in sung by a Hong Kong singer.
Yes.
And so that was and it was actually a hit in the East. It was actually a hit, which is surprising because it's such a terrible freaking song.
Was Eyes on Me Uematsu composition?
I think so. Yes, I think so. Yes, it was.
I didn't hear that.
Does that one get played at the Final Fantasy live shows or?
I don't know.
Is that the encore?
Yeah. But I guess we're gonna move on from Final Fantasy VIII because we're kind of running out of time. But Paul, do you want to talk about Vagrant Story?
I could talk about Vagrant Story. I'm not gonna go into Vagrant Story like I did on Tactics. I love Vagrant Story. I thought it was not necessarily underrated because at the time the reviews for it were just like fantastic. It was very, very well received. But it was also at the tail end of the PlayStation's life cycle. You know, you had the Dreamcast, which was fairly firmly entrenched, and you have the PlayStation 2 that's on the horizon. So, like any late generation game, it kind of goes a little bit underappreciated, I think. But to this day, like the cinematics of that game are second to none. And at the time, I thought it was just absolutely groundbreaking. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Ozzy, I know you had less of a positive experience with it.
Yeah, I mean, just to take a step back, it was released in May of 2000, and 1998 was a great year for Square. 2000 was the other big year, which kind of makes sense because the developers had like a 2-year turnaround period. Yeah. So a lot of great games were also released in 2000, and I distinctly remember when Vagrant Story came out, and I do recall the magazines hyping it up and saying, this is a fantastic game. I think when I first played it, because Paul, you had told me that it was one of your favorite games, and when I saw the cutscenes and I saw the dialogue, it was just very different, and it really drew me in, and I wanted to like this game so much, Paul. I really, really wanted to like this game, and it was a very similar situation to what you mentioned in Final Fantasy Tactics, which is that if you don't play the game right, you're gonna hit a wall, and that wall is gonna be very hard to overcome. And that's what happened to me. I just didn't play the game the right way. And that kind of bothered me because looking at it in hindsight, I think that games should allow you to play the way you want to play. And they shouldn't punish you for playing a way that the game offers you to play, but it's not the way that the developers want you to play. And so for me, that was very disappointing. But it is a game that, just because of the wonderful dialogue and the wonderful story, a very minimalist story, but like the fact that it's a Yasumi Matsuno game, it has a Shakespearean type of story. It makes me just want to go back to it, and I think I will. I think I will go back to it at some point, but it has a very distinct art style, very much in the vein of Final Fantasy Tactics, except with proportions that are more realistic.
Yes.
Also takes place in Ivalice, so it's part of the Ivalice set of games. But I have to say that I had to give up with it after trying to spend like 12 hours trying to figure out the game and just continuing to fail over and over again because of the shame mechanics.
Yeah.
So it's a game that is very deep, very complex, but you kind of have to really play with the mechanics and be willing to start over from scratch if necessary in order to play it the way that you need to play it.
And the one thing it has going for it in that regard is that it's not long. So if you do start over, it's not necessarily the end of the world. but it does suck to have to start over in any RPG. Like, that to me is kind of a fatal flaw. And I think, I don't know why that didn't happen to me. Frankly, I didn't even know it was a thing that could happen until it happened to you. I think it might have something to do with the time that I played it at, when I was like, 21 or what have you. And I had, again, endless appetite, endless patience. So maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know. But it's a shame you had to start over.
It's possible. And again, I'm going to say it again. I'm going to go back to this game at some point.
Yeah.
So I think it's one that, at the very least, it's worth trying. Yeah. And that's really what you should take out of this Squaresoft period, is that a lot of their games, maybe not all of them were masterpieces, but a lot of them were very interesting experiments.
Yeah. There has never been a game that I have not played that has intrigued me so much by aesthetic alone. The look of this game, everything from like the box art to the gameplay to everything is just, it screams like I need to play this game. So the fact that I haven't yet is very distressing to me. I think my Linkin Park loving 14-year-old self would have really enjoyed playing this.
Oh yeah. You definitely would have. You definitely would have taken a big, delicious bite out of Vagrant Story at that time. It's really, it's just we've gone on now for over an hour. It's yet another example of Squaresoft at the time pushing the envelope, exploring new boundaries more than any other developer, I would say.
Yeah, I think we can round out some of the other titles since we're running out of time. Final Fantasy IX also came out in 2000, and that's also a game that I wouldn't say divisive, but is very beloved by fans, but mainly because it harkens back to an earlier time period of Final Fantasy, and it really was meant to be kind of a retrospective on the Final Fantasy series. Yeah. And it goes back to white mages and fantasy tropes, and kind of moved away a lot from the sci-fi realist style that Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII built around. And it was actually developed contemporaneously with Final Fantasy VIII, but it felt like a very, very different game. And it came out right after the PS2 had already come out. So I'm not surprised that the game does not have as much popularity as the other games, but whoever played it probably says that it's in their top, probably their favorite Final Fantasy game.
It gave us the first furry Final Fantasy main character.
Oh, that's right.
Opening the doors to equality for all.
Yeah. Furries embraced.
Square has never gone back to that particular well. I'm not going to say that that's the only reason why, but, Yeah,
and I think when it came out, if I remember reading Electronic Gaming Monthly and the like, some people were put off by the art style. It was almost like a very chibi art style where the proportions were not accurate, and I think a lot of people coming off the heels of Final Fantasy VII and VIII, I don't think they really dug that. Yeah, but whoever gave it a shot was really, really amazed by it.
Yeah, but it also, it gave us Vivi, and I think Vivi is like the standard black mage, representation of Final Fantasy that you think of in 3D, right? Like,
couldn't agree more.
I think that he's probably, aside from maybe like Cloud and Sephiroth, I think he might be one of the more recognizable Final Fantasy characters in terms of casual people seeing that and being like, oh, that's Final Fantasy, maybe Moogles or something like that, but he's pretty big.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree. And it's one of those games where I have never played through it, and it's always been on my backlog, going back years and years and years, because I heard so many great things about it. So I do want to play it. And from what I hear, the game does take very dark turns in its storyline. So I'm really intrigued by it.
Yeah.
But just to round out a few of the other games, just to kind of quick fire.
I saw you had Threads of Fate on there.
Threads of Fate. I don't know if you guys played it.
I have, actually.
No, not me.
Of the all the random games on this list, Threads of Fate, I found it for $4 at a thrift store in Puerto Rico. It's probably the most obscure game I've ever found in a thrift store like that. I never got too into it. It did seem like fun. And it really just lies, most of the charm in this game lies in the art style. It's very like fairy tale-ish is probably the best way to describe it, like you put here, Ozzy, but it's very like wistful, sort of chibi in certain aspects. But basically the conceit is you control one of two characters, a boy character, a girl character, and follow their unique stories. And I think at some point they intertwine towards the end of the game. But having not played that much of it, that's about all I can say. It was fun enough. So I definitely recommend giving it a shot if you can find it for cheap.
Yeah, and I think that was the impression of this game. I think a lot of people said, well, it doesn't seem like it's that important. It doesn't seem like it's really pushing the envelope.
Yeah.
So I think it was ignored by the general masses.
Yeah, it doesn't
much. Another game that came out this year was Front Mission 3, and I want to talk about this one simply because it was an example of Square bringing over properties that had been Japan exclusive up to that point into the US with their newfound cachet in the Western world. And Front Mission 3 was a strategy RPG and very Western influence because it relied on mechs and the like, and it had a very realist kind of political tone to it. But it really, for me, it was an example of, Square bringing over intellectual properties that had not been released in the United States up to that point.
And I for one was very, very happy with it. Like I remember seeing Front Mission games in the magazines on the Super Famicom and looking at them and just being like, oh my god, this game scratches right where I itch, right? Strategy RPG with mechs, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And
I mean, oh, sorry, Paul. I was just going to say quickly that, I don't know if this had anything to do with it, but you're looking at late 90s, early 2000s. So we're looking at, the popularity of Gundam and Macross and Robotech
Absolutely.
and stuff like that.
Oh,
so,
certainly.
Yeah.
Certainly. I mean, you had Toonami at the time in which Gundam Wing played.
Yep.
And I remember because that's the time that I came to this country.
Mm-hmm.
And every single kid loved Gundam. It was between Dragon Ball Z and Gundam. And it was a great 1-2 punch. I think that was the time period where a lot of us really started to love anime. And it was the perfect time to bring out a game with mechs.
Yeah, absolutely. They brought it out at the right time. And I mean, it's a great game. Like it's not like Final Fantasy Tactics, but it is good at what it is. It's a solid strategy RPG, lots of customization with the mechs, which is a lot of fun, at least for me. And it's very adult looking, which is kind of what we were starting to demand of our games at the time, and kind of part of the small backlash against Final Fantasy IX.
Yeah. And I think just to follow from that line of thought, Paul, the other series that had not been released in the US for some time was the Mana series. And that year also saw the release of Legend of Mana. Before that, Secret of Mana was the other Mana game that had been recently released in the US and North America. And we had missed out on Seiken Densetsu 3, which was one of the bigger losses in terms of what we missed here in the States. But Legend of Mana came out, and unfortunately to kind of lukewarm reception. And it's a very beautiful game, but one that was not very well received critically. I think a lot of it is because it felt like it was very unfocused. It had a world building element, and because of that, it really didn't have a plot. And so people just kind of shrugged at it when they saw it. And also, as you said, Paul, it was kind of fantasy in its aesthetic. It had a very aesthetic of, caricatures and just illustrations and hand-drawn animation. And I don't think that's necessarily what gamers wanted at the time. They wanted realistic polygons and realistic characters. So not a game that actually had a lot of impact.
Yeah. Like Metal Gear Solid comes out and it changes everything, right? Suddenly you have movie quality, realism, and characters and so on and so forth. And then anything else that comes after that just automatically makes you think of Super Nintendo and childhood. And at the time, that was just not seen as a good thing. Nowadays, there's enough room for everything, and everything has its charm and its place. But back then, it was just kind of wild swings in one direction or another. Oh my god, this is amazing. We need all of our games to be this. And then it changes when someone else innovates, and the cycle continues.
Yeah.
So I think we can round out just a few of the other titles, just quickly, just mentioning them, but not necessarily going into them. We have the Bushido Blade series, which is a really cool fighting series that focused on on limbs and the like, and hitting limbs, and fights could go on for, like 10 seconds, or go on for minutes and minutes on end.
Usually,
it didn't have a timer.
Usually minutes on end. I remember Bushido Blade, and it was a game that we really, really wanted to like because it did something very different. Squaresoft, right? Mid-90s Squaresoft, that's kind of what they were doing, or mid-late 90s. And, but more often than not, it just kind of involved us running around the map, being afraid to die. And, the other thing to it as well was, boy, oh boy, the collision detection in that game was rough. Really, really rough. To the point where it just kind of, between that and the turtling, great concept, not so great execution.
Yeah. And also there were other games that Square didn't release here. One of my favorite ones that no one knows about is Racing Lagoon, which is basically a racing RPG hybrid. And I don't think anyone I've spoken to actually knows about this game, but I wish so bad that they would have come out with this game over here. They probably didn't come out with it because it took place in the Japanese highway system.
Yeah.
And they were probably thinking, players are not going to know this and they're not going to identify with it. But that's another one that came out. And there are a few others that came out only in Japan. A few other games, Chocobo's Dungeon. They did a few Chocobo games. Chocobo Racing, which was their kart racing spin-off. And just to round it out and finish it up, there was Chrono Cross, which is a pretty RPG that you shouldn't play.
Oh, come on.
Well, we've gone into Chrono Cross on this podcast before.
Yes, and so I think we can finish. We can finish with Chrono Cross, so don't play it, guys. Okay, so I think that covers it all, guys. I think that this has been a successful episode. And guys, just a quick fire. Favorite Square RPG, or actually just favorite Squaresoft title of the time, Paul?
Final Fantasy Tactics.
Oh, I wouldn't have figured. Arnie?
Probably shit. I don't know. There's
come on, man.
It's probably Parasite Eve. Honestly, now that I'm playing it, I'm really, really enjoying it.
That's a cop out.
No, I would have to say that because I haven't beaten any of the Final Fantasies. Like I never made it to the end of any of them. So I can't. Well, it's Final Fantasy.
It's either between Final Fantasy VII and Parasite Eve for me, but I have such a soft spot for Parasite Eve. But I guess that runs it out for us, guys. My name is Ozzy. You can find us on Instagram. We go by Region Free Gamers, so that's just our handle. So it's very easy to find. We are available on iTunes, and we're available on Google Play, or whatever they call it nowadays. So if you can leave us a review, it really does help us. You can find me on Instagram at Shadow the Collector with periods in between. Where can we find you, Paul?
I'm at Paul's Game Room, Paul's_Game Room.
And where can we find you, Arnie?
You can find me at Welcome to the Game, the word welcome, number 2, the game. You can also find me at Tommy Tallarico fanclub.net. Recently launched, looking for new members, but
the loneliest site on the internet.
Next episode, Tommy Tallarico retrospective. Get ready for it, guys. It's gonna be
yes.
I'm actually this is actually gonna happen. I'm gonna petition hard for that episode.
If you guys haven't realized, our dear Finnish friend is not with us, Masa, and you can find Masa at Masa Jarvin in 09. And Masa couldn't join us because, unfortunately, Finland did not get any of these RPGs mostly. And even if he did, he didn't have the language capabilities to really get into them. So he doesn't really have as much experience. So he decided to set this one out. But we miss him. We miss our dear Finnish friend. And we want you to follow him because he needs more followers because he has like 20,000 already. So in any case, we've gone along. Thank you guys for joining us. This has been an episode of the Region Free Gamers podcast. So until next time, see you around.
See ya.